Hi, Musa. Did you hear the question that I'd posed to you? I was just saying that in the interest of the viewers, can you just take us through some of the history of Chief Ogolla?
So Chief Ogolla has served in the Kenyan military for quite some time. In fact, he's serving in that military has happened since 1984. He rose through the ranks of the military as the head of the Kenyan Air Force. As you know, Kenya has three arms of its military: the Kenyan Air Force, the Kenyan Armed Force, as well as the Kenyan Navy. And one of the interesting things about him is that his ascension to this particular role didn't come without any controversy. In fact, it is said that relations between himself and President Ruto were quite icy. And the government, in fact, tried to push back from his appointment back last year, citing the fact that he supported the opposition parties and supported claims that the last elections that Kenya had, were not free and fair. So his death really comes at a time where the Kenyan military, with the government, the executive branch of the state, relations have been quite frosty at a time when Kenya is dealing with multiple challenges in the region. One of those challenges being, of course, the issue of terrorism, the rise of the Al-Shabaab in East Africa has been quite a problem, but as well as challenges within that region, whether you think of the Great Lakes, the issues around the DRC, or you think as what has happened in the north of Kenya, when you think about the civil war that happened and ensued in Ethiopia. So the fact that he dies 1 year into the job will raise questions about the security of Kenya, but more so their strategy in terms of dealing with security challenges such as terrorism, which Kenya has had a history of.
I mean, then, with that said, Musa, what would you say are the main factors that the investigators should be looking into in determining the cause of the crash? Is there a suspicion of foul play?
Well, definitely a country like Kenya, with the kind of security challenges it has had, the fact that it has gone through times of insurrection as well as civil conflict, and it is a quite politically fluid country, where there are many parties that are often vying really for power, and the military was quite critical in that nexus of power. So, of course, the investigators will be investigating any foul play. That will be very critical. And in terms of this particular crash, but for now, investigations are still early. But, given the seniority of the officials who died on this crash, it is one issue that Kenya's political leadership, its security cluster and agencies, including the intelligence, will have to be seized with. Of course, a question arises, was there prior intelligence? If there was foul play, was there prior intelligence provided, or some knowledge, covert or overt knowledge, that would have been known by the Kenyan government or its security cluster? Those are questions that hopefully the investigation will yield results.
And Musa, you've touched on this, but I just want you to unpack it a little more in terms of how then might this incident impact the stability of Kenya's military leadership as well as its operations?
Well, look, for now, time will tell. But I mean, like any country, Kenya has its own rules of how it deals with succession. It is a democratic state, and so the hiring of a new commander will obviously meet the public eye. Now, what will be critical, of course, is to ensure, number one, to deal with this particular case, to ensure that there was no foul play, and two, to ensure the stability of Kenya's military forces that are quite heavily invested in ensuring both security in some of the hotspot areas where terrorism has arisen in Kenya, but as well as, if you think of the challenges that Kenya's military has had over the past 5 years, case in point, the fact that in the MONUSCO, the UN MONUSCO military intervention, the peacekeeping military intervention in the DRC, Kenya's contribution has been replaced by the South African contribution. And that's quite telling about the regional politics, but also the capacity within the Kenyan military, which, like the South African military, has come in at times with criticism about its ability and its readiness to deal with conflict but play a larger role in the region.
What potential implications do you think would come out in the findings of the investigation domestically and internationally?
Well, look, domestically, if it turns out that there was foul play and it happens to be a case of domestic action, it will be interesting to see the political ramifications, particularly for President Ruto and his party, but as well as for the military. But, from an external perspective, one would want to believe that there wouldn't have been an external hand in this. Otherwise, it would really just be another flagging point for the region, a region that currently is facing several points of tension and conflict. Whether you think of Somalia, whether you think of what happened in Ethiopia, whether you think currently what is going on in South Sudan, for example, or the DRC, Kenya's leadership has often been very critical in finding stability and peace in that region. And so it would be interesting if there was any foul play from any external hand. Who would that be? Kenya is, like South Africa, like Nigeria, an important, economic player, an important player even in terms of international relations. And so peace and security in this country has ripple effects in what happens in the region. It's for a good example, it's like what has happened in Senegal recently, the implications there for what happens in West Africa. One could liken what's happening in Kenya and the importance of this country to Senegal in this particular instance.
And any key challenges that you think the investigators may face while conducting this investigation?
Well, if there is, a third hand here, if this is in fact the act of bad play, then it is likely that they will meet political resistance if such a scandal were to expose the government or senior members of the military. It would call to question the credibility of the state, of the government, but also, the need often that we don't see in African countries, where that fine line between where the military begins and where civilian government begins has often been blurred. And so it will raise questions if it is to be found that there was a domestic hand in this particular matter. If there is an international one, Kenya will likely have to take, diplomatic measures or take measures that would meet the current action, depending on which country that would be and whether Kenya does have the political appetite for such a move.
Now, you stated earlier on that there were icy relations between the general as well as President Ruto. How transparent and accountable do you think the Kenyan government is likely to be throughout this investigation?
Well, look, it will be important for President Ruto to be transparent. I mean, the man ran a campaign on an anti-corruption basis that he was coming in to clean up Kenyan politics. And so for such a man who has made such a commitment, it would be off brand for him all of a sudden to behave in a manner that would be suspicious. But secondly, Kenya does have a very robust media structure, as well as political opposition parties are quite vocal and quite active. And so you are dealing with a country whose democracy is quite vibrant, whose political institutions are quite vibrant, and they will be able to weather the storm in a manner that at times, does not happen in other African countries. In this particular case, given the country that we are talking about, it is unlikely that the government will try to close ranks. It would hurt their credibility, particularly in a country where the politics is often more competitive than what we see in South Africa. Well, that depends in a month's time, of course.
Mm-hmm.
But in a country like Kenya, where the politics is fluid and often competitive, it would be, I would say, to the government's benefit to be quite transparent as it comes to these investigations.
And I mean, my next question to you was that, could this incident have any political ramifications, such as affecting the public trust in the government or even in the military?
Certainly it can do that. And trust is a very important thing here, Katleho, when we think about democracies often, right? So the trust in one's government, in the institutions of the state, to govern in a manner that protects national interests. And one of the chief national interests is the issue of security, peace and security. And in this case, any action that would undermine the people's trust in these institutions is very dangerous, particularly for a country like Kenya, would be very dangerous. A country that tends to face tribal challenges, where the politics is run by tribal lines. And so it is important that to maintain this tribal peace in a country such as Kenya, that the trust is often maintained. And that is why it will be important to see transparency not only from the government, but transparency as well coming through from the military will be very key in order to ensure that trust in the state is maintained, which is so critical for the legitimacy of any government and more so legitimacy for any democracy.
Lastly, Musa, we saw a similar incident of this nature when 10 soldiers perished in a helicopter crash near Nairobi in June of 2021. What measures, if any, do you think the Kenyan government should take to prevent such incidents from occurring in the future?
Well, certainly, every government has to maintain their military, and, maintenance of military goes beyond the paying of personnel. It is about ensuring that, the equipment you have, the assets you have, whether they be helicopters, airplanes, whatever type of equipment, aircraft carriers, are able are fully functional and are able to maintain the maintenance of your soldiers while being combat ready. That's very important. Now, in this particular case, one would have to look out at what are the similarities between this particular crash and the 2021 crash. And secondly, then, to look at what measures were taken after the 21 particular crash. And, given that we are where we're at now, what are the type of measures that the Kenyan military and the government must then take? But also, was this a failure of intelligence? Because remember, if there's been foul play here and foul play to the extent that it would reach, high levels of the military in this particular way, which is quite unusual, especially for a country that is not in war, by the way, then there's questions about what is the role of the intelligence and where was the Kenyan intelligence in order to ensure that if there was any hints of wrongdoing that would have taken place, that they were able to nip it. And so was this a failure of intelligence? Who knows? The investigation will bear the fruits of that.
I know Musa had said lastly, but now that you raised this in your answer, does this mean that there needs to be questions that are asked in terms of the president's security himself?
Well, certainly I would believe that in such situations as this, that the security of the president, his cabinet, members of parliament, senior members of the organs of state would come to question here, naturally so. And so the question will be, are the Kenyans paying enough attention towards security for their leaders? And secondly, if this is an external issue, if there were external contributions towards this, their nations, at the kind of work and contribution it has done in the region, Could there be in the hand of Al-Sunna or Al-Shabaab in terms of this particular incident? And if not, then again, members of parliament will have to raise the questions about the kind of money that is being spent, whether it is being spent in the right places, and questions are going to be asked. This is an important issue, Katleho, because this country is so important both regionally but also continentally.
Certainly, Musa Mdunge. Always a pleasure having you on the show. We really appreciate your insights. That was political analyst Musa Mdunge speaking to us there about the helicopter crash that involves the military chief, General Francis Ogolla of Kenya.